All right, and I'm going to introduce our host for today. He's a good gentleman from Eastern Karelia, Finland, Kim Väisänen.
Good morning, everyone. I think that we are going to have an exciting day, and I always test people first in the morning, middle of the day, and end of the day. You know how it goes. Let's see. Are you ready? Never mind. Let's try it. Everybody in the House of Love say yeah. Yes. And this is supposed to be a startup event. It sounds like a funeral. Let's try it one more time. Everybody in the House of Love say yeah. Why don't we get Monique on the stage, because you are not too much help this morning. Okay, let's try it again. No, not yet. Monique, you said on a backstage that we should challenge ourselves.
Yeah.
I was challenging the audience. How did that go?
I think they need to wake up.
Yeah, I think that...
Maybe they are waking up.
Yeah, the warrior coffee...
Warrior
coffee should kick in.
I think we need to hear more, yeah.
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 Hey, what is the best way of bringing more women to the IT industry?
I think we need to talk about that more. It has to be an imperative, a business imperative, at least at the CEO level.
So you are saying that CEOs have the crucial role?
They absolutely do. If they don't, what happens is that we see painful dependence on wonderful diversity officers, and that's it. That's more tactical.
Is that the Silicon Valley approach?
I see more of that in Silicon Valley, and I think that all of what we need to do is think about how we accelerate cultural change.
Absolutely. Hey, let's give a big hand for the Monique, who is gonna entertain us next 20 minutes. Hopefully you have better luck than I did.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Listen, this is all about, if you look at the presentation that I have here, it's more of a challenge on how we use technology to accelerate cultural change. Cultural change where we can think about achieving gender parity, not gender neutrality, not necessarily parity, neutrality, where we don't have to really talk about this anymore. So if there are two things that you're going to take away from this morning's presentation, and a challenge to you all, is how do we accelerate cultural change in the 21st century on this topic, especially as it has been talked about in Silicon Valley, and what are the real motivators in terms of really thinking about incentives towards that change. So let's proceed. A little bit about me. You wouldn't think that Cisco is talking about this, but we are. I have a background in technology, mainly in the networking space, so I'm not going to talk to you about IoT, and I'm not going to talk to you about cloud computing. I'm really going to talk about this notion of accelerating that change. And so I think very, very carefully about this combinatorial of social science and engineering. Social science and engineering, where we're talking about social science engineering together. Here are some of the statistics that, just to frame up the discussion a little bit. If we think about the world's population of 7.4 billion people, 51% of that population represents women today. It is no surprise, ladies and gentlemen, that it is one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. That's number 5, which is gender equality. Number 1 being ending, if you will, poverty. So there is obviously a correlation to this topic. In the end, what we have to think about is inclusion in all of its modalities. Not just about women, not just about men, but all of its modalities. We have to think about that when we look at what can be done to accelerate cultural change. The fact of the matter is, we're not going fast enough in the 21st century. In fact, I was in Silicon Valley last week. I was at an international conference, and one of the CEOs stood up and said it will take at least 2 or 3 generations before we attain this notion of parity. And I'm thinking in in Silicon Valley in the 21st century to think that it would take 2, 3, 4 generations before we have some notion of parity, we have to think about what will accelerate that change, even if we think about technology in doing so. And so the notion comes to, what about artificial intelligence? How can we think about doing that? I was also involved in an award, and one of the judges asked me, you know, what would it look like in terms of us looking at success? And success for me is that we don't have to talk about this anymore. This judge in London told me it will take another 2 or 3 generations. We are talking, ladies and gentlemen, of 88 to 100 years. In the 21st century, clearly, that cannot be the case. The fact of the matter is, we are infected by something called, this is our human bug, by something called unconscious bias. We are all infected. In fact, when I was in the backstage talking with Kim, we were talking about startup and startup businesses. And what Kim told me was, you know, I had a startup, and I thought, well, yeah, that's like your baby. And he said, no, Monique, let's think of it as a business, not a baby. That's an unconscious bias. That's an example. So we're all infected. And what happens, as I frame and tell you the story and challenge all of you as entrepreneurs and leaders in your business to think about accelerating cultural change, is that this bias gets infected into an organization. It gets infected into the DNA of an organization. If you think about that, that's extremely a big challenge, because it talks about what we're looking at is how do we shift cultures and behaviors intelligently. So here's one challenge. You know, from David Hume, what we're thinking about, David Hume as a philosopher fundamentally said, you have to be motivated. All of us have some kind of intention of motivation. Are we thinking, ladies and gentlemen, of the right metric? What does that metric look like? What is the metric, what can the metric be other than the presentation of pink and blue and whatever color that you have in statistics? So, could we think about creating something, you can call it whatever you want to, I'm calling it a social entrepreneurial currency, where we start to actually gamify behavioral change and think about what gamification of behavioral change can look like. This is why, as technologists, we have to think about what could that be. So I start to award you for the desired behavior that I want to see in an organization. I think this is extremely interesting from a perspective. So this gamification is very interesting. What should be the measure? That's our opportunity. The other thing to think about, when I'm looking at the notion of the use of artificial intelligence, I'm thinking beyond the narrow uses of artificial intelligence that we know of. That is the use, for example, from a financial perspective we see, or from a health perspective. I'm thinking beyond that. I'm thinking actually in terms of really looking at behavioral change. And there's some really good work at Stanford University on this. This notion of how we can think about behaviors. So it's what I don't know, for example. What I don't know is very interesting. And think about how you could possibly opt in to participate. By the way, this is about opting in. This is about you as a member of an organization to come in, opt in, and participate in this interaction on biases, an interaction on your own behavior. And I think this becomes very, very interesting. Think about it. Today you took vacation. I'm going to award you 10 entrepreneurial points. And maybe an aggregation of that, like in Bitcoin, becomes some notion of your bonus. You are involved as a member of an organization, and you opt in to choose to be involved. Because if we don't do that, what happens is that it becomes dictated, and I don't think we want that dictation to occur. So that is kind of an interesting notion of, hey, if we go back to David Hume's thesis, that you have to have some level of motivation, that's an example of motivation. Clearly, we can sit together here and nod affirmatively, but Monique, that's not how we want to do things. And yes, we can say, we can look at it not affirmatively, just as we nod about our climate, that we need to think about social entrepreneurship for a purpose and for some notion of profit. But there has to be, this is my thesis, an acceleration toward that cultural change that we desire. So that's a pause here. The other notion is, if you agree that we could use artificial intelligence to accelerate the change, and I'm discussing all of these hypotheses with machine learning experts, it's not about learning machines or learning inferences that is known. We know that. What I'm more interested in is what is not known. And this goes beyond this notion of textio, about gender-neutral language. What is not known? What is really, if you look back into my thesis before, on on unconscious bias, what do we not know when yet can be inferred? Some very interesting work. And by the way, this is all the challenge, it's all nascent. And that's why I'm here, because to challenge you as developers and entrepreneurs to actually think about developing in this space. There is work in this space at Stanford University, at the Deep Dive group. In fact, they have use cases on human trafficking. So why couldn't we think about a use case, if you will, on achieving, if you will, some notion of gender neutrality overall? So you could think about, hey, you advertise something today, here's your figure. And by the way, there's inferences on your images in terms of what is inferred, there's inferences, if you will, on your text, what is inferred, etc. But you advertise today a job description. Interactive, you're opting in. But we noticed that you may have excluded a certain portion of your population. Is that or was that your intention? And here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen, is you become very interactive in the discussion. And oh, by the way, if we go back to this hypothesis about the metric maybe being some kind of notion of social entrepreneurial currency, we can think about, here's how you're aggregating your currency, and by the way, you may be operating in some kind of deficit, and you want to know about it. I think this is really, really crucial, as you want to know about what that deficit it looks like. Really interesting work here in that I go back to the challenge of how we can use AI. I go back to the challenge of what is inferred and what is not inferred. I go back to the challenge of you as a member of an organization to be able to opt in or opt out and to be interactive versus, for example, the dependency on an inclusion officer of a company or of an organization. What we could think about as an implication here, ladies and gentlemen, is that the inclusion officer becomes less operational. You, as a member of the organization or an entity or whatever that may look like, become very interactive and become very focused and opting in the discussion, and you are notified of what may be a bias actively. You're notified of that behavior very actively. As I go to a very call to action, I think we need to think about what that acceleration looks like. I think we need to think about exploring gamification to absolutely achieve this notion of parity versus neutrality versus parity. And by the way, neutrality means everybody, not just men and women. It's not an or here, it's an and. Everybody. I think we need to create a new discipline of social science engineering versus social sciences or engineering. Social science engineering becomes very interesting. It is not social engineering. And this is very, very new. I just talked to an entrepreneur in New York and a neuroscientist, and this is something that they're very, very much exploring in this space. Because we need to have the humanism embedded in our technology and the humanism active in what we do. I think this is very, very key. I think we need to think about, ladies and gentlemen, to look at how AI can accelerate that change in the industry, rather than we becoming statistics. I'm in engineering, and I'm frankly tired of statistics that gets reported out every single year, and yet, remember what Kim asked us to do is to challenge our thinking, and yet in some cases we haven't moved, most cases, the needle in 10 years. So I think we have the power of the and here, the power of focuses on technology to become and to accelerate the change that we so desire, not only in what we teach, not only in how we develop, but also on the uses of technology. There is no doubt a business imperative here, no doubt. Tons and tons of studies as to why it's a business imperative. But unless you, if you're a head of a company, decide that this is an imperative, it will never, ever be done. And so my call to action, last but not least, is we have every reason to do this, and we have every reason to do it together. Because right now, ladies and gentlemen, it is a huge, huge statistic that we can actually move in terms of what is the entrepreneurial currency that we desire, that behavioral change that we desire, rather than looking at it from another 188 years. The last personal subject that I will say is that last week I was in an international conference. I talked to an audience like this, and a group of people stayed behind, and two women were in tears because they don't see the needle moving. And I think that this is a call for action. We can do it, and we can do it together. Thank you very, very much.
No questions?
Questions?
Yeah. Now you have your greatest moment of asking questions about this extremely important topic.
Do I have your attention?
I think you have the attention.
Yeah,
There's a
great.
question.
Yeah.
You haven't really adapted the slow Swiss style. You were trying to
I know.
escape.
Hi.
Yes.
Just a short question.
Yes.
How do you actually apply all this at Cisco?
You know what? So that's a great question. How do I apply it at Cisco? Well, the great opportunity is that I get to do that in terms of the exploratory research here in this area. I think this is right now going back to Kim's response of how are we thinking about it as a company, or how are we thinking about it, we have to accelerate the change. So I've been asked to actually look at it as how we accelerate the change and thinking about it from a technology perspective. Right now, at Cisco, candidly speaking, what we have are, we have people, what you see is this affirmative, yes, we care about it. There's an affirmative. But what you don't see is something what I call intentional and declarative from a business perspective. So we need to do better. Does that answer your question? Great.
That was a great question. So maybe I could ask you one.
Yeah, sure.
Is it going to take few generations, few decades, or few years?
I'm challenging this audience to say no. We cannot afford to wait a few generations, a few years. We keep thinking about, we keep talking about it, and it's the 21st century. So therefore, that's why I think we can think about you, all of us, being involved in that discussion as member of organizations, and maybe looking at how we use technology to do so. I would like to come back here and say, maybe in a year, and say, hey, look at the progress that we've made. Because rather than just being a statistic, I think that we have a chance. I'm going to say we cannot, let me answer this way. We cannot afford to wait 2 or 3 generations.
Thank you. There's another question.
Yeah, sorry, one more question.
No, don't apologize, please. It's all about us.
Okay, thanks. So I'm quite interested in this gender differentiation at the job. Back in my country, I come from Romania. We have a sort of meetings, they are called Lean In. It's actually an action started by Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook. How do you actually interact? how your ideas interact with this movement. Do you know something about Lean In?
Oh, yes. So yes, I know a lot about Lean In, Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In. So, in fact, I met with, just on this topic, I met with an engineering director at Facebook who is very interested in this area because he's actually been looking at artificial intelligence and the use of artificial intelligence. Sheryl Sandberg, what she did was put a spotlight, and she's actually funded quite a bit of social science work on this whole issue of women. What I'm looking at it is not just women, it's the end of neutrality overall and how we can use technology to do this. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a moonshot. This is absolutely a moonshot. And so I think that using it together as a moonshot becomes even more interesting. Beyond shining the light, and yet we're still talking about it, and beyond talking about what organizations to their credit are trying to do in this space, I'm looking at it far beyond Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In. And what she did, to her credit, was actually shine that light. Does that answer your question? Fantastic.
Unfortunately, we are...
Oh, well, you're going to talk to me afterwards.
Let's give still a big hand to the Monique. Thank you.